What's an old black man like you doing in a place like this? The officer sneered as he stepped out of the squad car, eyes scanning Luther Grant like he was a stain on the sidewalk. They didn't check his name, didn't care. To them, he was just another nobody loitering outside a high-end restaurant. They threw him in the back of a squad car, mocked him in the holding cell, and laughed when he warned them they were making a mistake. They saw an old man who should be afraid of them, a black man whose words didn't matter. But they didn't know they had just arrested Luther Grant, a retired Supreme Court justice. And when he made his phone call, it wouldn't be to a lawyer, it would be to the Chief Justice of the United States. By the time they realized who he was, it would be far too late. The Hamiltons stood at the heart of the city, a restaurant of whispered reservations and exclusive clientele. The kind of place where the doormen held their posts like sentinels guarding the threshold between privilege and those who did not belong. Luther Grant stood just outside, wrapped in quiet patience, waiting. His granddaughter Claire was inside, finishing an event with colleagues from Georgetown Law, a dinner he had politely declined, allowing her the space to navigate the circles of ambition on her own. He had told her to take her time. He would be right here when she was ready. Across the street, a squad car idled near the curb, its engine a low growl against the quiet murmur of the night. Officers Jake Rower and Brent Kincaid had been watching him for several minutes now, their easy laughter giving way to something colder, something unspoken but understood between men who had drawn their conclusions long before facts entered the equation. "Look at this guy," Rower muttered, shaking his head with an amused smirk. "They always find their way into places they don't belong." Kincaid exhaled through his nose, his jaw tightening. "I swear they're getting bolder every year. Bet you anything he's waiting to hit someone up for cash. Probably tailing one of these rich folks when they leave." They crossed the street with the slow, deliberate stride of men who expected compliance before they had even spoken. "Sir, we're going to need you to move along," Kincaid said, his voice thick with authority and unearned confidence. Luther did not turn when he heard the footsteps approaching, nor did he startle when the voice came. He inhaled evenly, allowing the moment to settle before shifting his gaze toward them. "I'm waiting for my granddaughter," he said simply, his voice smooth and measured. Rower scoffed, dragging the syllables out like a man humoring a child's excuse. "See, that's the thing. You've been standing here for a while now, and we've had complaints about suspicious activity. Can't have people loitering outside a nice place like this." Luther reached into his coat, retrieving his wallet. "I assume you'll want to see some identification then." Without warning, Rower slapped the wallet from Luther's hand. It hit the pavement, bills and cards spilling out. Luther did not flinch. For the first time, his expression shifted, not to anger, not to fear, but to something far more unsettling in its stillness. A patience so practiced, so deeply ingrained that it became something more than silence. Kincaid stepped forward, his boot coming down firmly onto the wallet, pressing it into the cold pavement. "Didn't ask for ID," he muttered, his voice just barely above a sneer. Rower let out a short, humorless chuckle. "You got a problem with following directions, old man?" Luther's hands remained at his sides, his shoulders squared, his posture unyielding. He did not look at the wallet crushed beneath Kincaid's boot. He did not look at Rower's smug expression. Instead, he let the moment stretch between them, let the weight of their actions settle in the air. And then, with quiet certainty, he spoke. "You are making a mistake." Kincaid leaned in. "Yeah? And what exactly do you think is going to happen here?" "You're going to find out," Luther said quietly. Hurried footsteps cracked through the air. "Get your hands off him." Claire's voice rang out as she ran toward them. "That man is Luther Grant, Justice Luther Grant. He is a retired Supreme Court justice." Rower and Kincaid barely spared her a glance. "Ma'am, step back," Kincaid said without looking at her, his tone bored, dismissive. Claire's eyes widened, her heart hammering against her ribs as she came to a sudden stop just a few feet away. "That man is Luther Grant, Justice Luther Grant. He is a retired Supreme Court justice. Do you even understand what you're doing right now?" The words landed with force, not just because of what they meant, but because Claire did not sound like a woman pleading for sense. She sounded like a prosecutor presenting evidence before a jury. For the first time, Rower hesitated, his grip loosening slightly. Kincaid frowned, his gaze flickering briefly toward Luther, as if suddenly, for the first time, he was actually looking at the man in front of him and not just the black body they had already judged guilty. But then the moment passed, and Rower scoffed, shaking his head, his smirk returning with an ease that sent a cold chill through Claire's spine. Oh yeah? A Supreme Court justice, huh? Kincaid let out a slow, deliberate chuckle. Well, isn't that cute? Looks like Grandpa's been telling bedtime stories. Claire's breath caught in her throat, her fingers tightening around her phone as she hit record, the camera now trained directly on the officers as they twisted Luther's arms behind his back and snapped the cold steel cuffs over his wrists. "You're making a mistake," she said, her voice shaking now, the realization settling deep in her bones. Rower grinned, shoving Luther toward the back seat. "Funny, that's exactly what he said." Claire's vision blurred with a rush of fury and helplessness as she watched the door slam shut, the hollow sound reverberating through the night, final and damning. But even as she stared in horror, even as her breath came in sharp, ragged gasps, she caught sight of something else, something that sent a sharp, unexpected chill through her spine. Luther was watching her. From the back seat of the car, his posture straight, his hands resting calmly in his lap. And he was not afraid. He was waiting, because he knew something they didn't, because they had made the wrong mistake. And by the time they realized it, there would be no escape. Inside the vehicle, the air was thick with an arrogance so casual, so unchecked that it filled every inch of the space, pressing against Luther's skin with the same suffocating weight as the steel around his wrists. Rower adjusted the rearview mirror, his grin lazy as he met Luther's gaze through the glass, his fingers drumming idly against the steering wheel as if he were enjoying the hum of a favorite song. "You know," Kincaid drawled, his voice carrying that familiar blend of boredom and cruelty. "You people never learn." Luther did not react. He had heard it before. The words, the cadence, the inflection. It always started the same way. Something offhand, something meant to sound casual, but laced with the kind of ugliness that could curdle in a man's gut. He did not flinch. He did not shift. He simply waited. Rower chuckled, shaking his head. "Yeah, man. It's like, what's the play here, huh? You think if you wear the nice coat, stand outside the fancy places, you get a little respect? That how it works?" Luther held his gaze in the mirror, his voice smooth, deliberate. "I don't need to earn respect from men like you." Rower let out a sharp laugh, nudging Kincaid in the arm. "Oh, we got a real classy one, huh?" Kincaid smirked, shaking his head. "Yeah, but that's the thing, though. It don't matter how much you dress it up, don't matter how old or well-spoken you are. End of the day, you're still just—" He paused, letting the word hang in the air. "A black man." The word hung there, undeniable, unflinching, cutting through the shallow humor like a scalpel. Kincaid smirked, but something in his posture stiffened, as though he hadn't expected Luther to let it sit there so plainly, hadn't expected him to strip the pretense from their little game so effortlessly. Rower shook his head, scoffing under his breath. "Damn right you are." Kincaid leaned back against the seat, exhaling through his nose, his fingers tapping against his thigh. "And that's the problem, isn't it?" he mused, his voice dropping into something lower, something meant to provoke. "You walk around thinking you belong, thinking you're one of them, thinking just 'cause you dress right and talk right you get to be something more than what you are." Luther tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. "And what is that?" Kincaid smirked. "A problem." There it was, the unspoken truth spoken plainly, without hesitation, without shame. The word landed with the kind of certainty that men like these carried in their bones, the kind that had been passed down through generations of unchecked power, of leashed violence, of hands gripping batons with the same ease their grandfathers had gripped ropes. Luther exhaled slowly, his wrists shifting slightly against the cuffs. Then, after a long moment of silence, he leaned forward just slightly, the cuffs pressing into his wrists, but he did not care. His voice carried that same quiet weight he had wielded in courtrooms, that same deliberate cadence that had unraveled weaker men than these. "Tell me," he said, his tone almost conversational. "Do you believe that because the knife is 6 inches deep instead of 12, that means you are not still cutting?" Rower blinked. Kincaid frowned, his smirk faltering. Luther continued, his voice steady, unshaken. "You want me to be grateful because the wound isn't as deep as it once was? Because the hand holding the blade wears a uniform instead of a hood? Because instead of ropes you use pens, instead of whips you use laws, instead of burning crosses you burn futures? You want to call it progress, but all you have done is learned how to cut quietly. And now you stand here, asking why the bleeding hasn't stopped. Silence. Complete and absolute. Rower's jaw tensed. Kincaid exhaled through his nose, shifting in his seat uncomfortably. Luther settled back against the hard plastic, his eyes meeting Rower's in the mirror once more. "No," he said simply. "I will not thank you for this." Rower scoffed, rolling his shoulders as he forced a laugh, but it sounded weaker now. Thinner, the previous confidence chipped just slightly at the edges. "Damn, you talk a lot for someone in cuffs." Kincaid smirked, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Yeah, maybe we need to take a little detour. Show you how things used to be done." Luther studied them both, absorbing their every word, every flicker of expression, filing them away carefully, precisely. And then, after a long moment, he exhaled, his shoulders easing, his face settling into something eerily calm, something practiced. "Enjoy this while it lasts," he said softly. Rower frowned, his fingers flexing slightly against the wheel. "What the hell's that supposed to mean?" Luther tilted his head slightly, a quiet amusement settling into his gaze. Something so slight, so subtle that it sent a prickle of unease down Kincaid's spine. "It means you should savor these last few moments," Luther murmured, "because you do not yet realize what you have done." Kincaid scoffed, rolling his eyes. "Oh yeah? And what exactly have we done?" Luther held his gaze, letting the weight of his silence press against them, letting the anticipation settle, the slow creeping realization that something was wrong beginning to take root in the back of their minds. And then finally, just as they pulled into the precinct parking lot, just as the first flicker of hesitation crossed Rower's face, just as Kincaid's smirk faltered, Luther smiled. "You'll find out soon enough." And as the car came to a stop, as the weight of the moment settled into the space between them, neither officer could shake the feeling that something had just shifted. Something was coming. And for the first time since the night had begun, they were the ones who should have been afraid. At the precinct, the station was quiet at this hour. A few officers lingering near their desks, finishing up paperwork, cracking tired jokes, sipping stale coffee from dented thermoses. It was a slow night, the kind that invited complacency, the kind that let men like Rower and Kincaid feel untouchable. They processed him in silence, barely glancing at his wallet, tossing it onto the counter without ceremony. The sergeant on duty, Tom O'Malley, barely looked up from his paperwork. "What have we got?" he asked, his voice flat, already reaching for the intake forms before Rower even opened his mouth. "Vagrancy, loitering, failure to comply," Rower listed off casually. Dropping the file onto the desk, O'Malley grunted in acknowledgement, flipping a page before holding out a hand. "ID." Kincaid snorted, reaching into his pocket and tossing Luther's wallet onto the counter. "Might want to run it. Something tells me it's not real." Luther exhaled quietly. O'Malley barely glanced at the ID before tossing it aside, waving toward the hallway that led to the holding cells. "Go ahead and process him. He can sit in there till morning." Luther turned his head slightly, his voice smooth as glass. "I will be making my phone call now." O'Malley sighed, rolling his eyes as he waved a dismissive hand. Yeah. You'll get your call when I say so." Luther did not move. "I will be making my phone call now," he repeated, the weight of his voice filling the space between them like a slow gathering storm. Rower scoffed. "Jesus, he thinks he's got rights." O'Malley groaned, waving him off. "Whatever. Let him call his damn lawyer." They shoved Luther into a holding cell, the door clanging shut behind him with a hollow, final sound. But Luther simply sat down on the cold metal bench, folded his coat beside him, placed his hat on top, and waited. He had made his phone call, not to a lawyer, but to Chief Justice Alan Whitmore. And now, the wheels were already in motion. The phone had rung twice before the voice on the other end answered, crisp and efficient, the kind of voice that had spent a lifetime commanding rooms and deciding the fate of the country from behind a bench. Alan Whitmore. Luther had allowed a moment to pass before speaking, letting recognition settle in. "Alan." A pause. A sharp intake of breath. The rustle of fabric as the Chief Justice of the United States sat forward in his chair. "Luther." Luther adjusted his grip on the receiver, his voice smooth, deliberate, calm. "I need you to listen very carefully." The silence that followed was thick, the weight of old cases and long conversations pressing between them. the kind of pause that carried more understanding than words ever could. "Where are you?" Whitmore's voice had changed, shifting from casual recognition to something sharper, something controlled but edged with the first flickers of concern. Luther let the quiet stretch just a little longer, not out of hesitation, but to let the reality settle before he said it aloud. 17th Precinct. The line went dead silent. Then a slow, measured inhale. "What?" "They arrested me outside the Hamilton." Luther continued, his tone unshaken, controlled, each syllable a scalpel cutting away ignorance and assumption. "Two officers, Rower and Kincaid. They did not check my identification. They did not ask questions. They assumed I was a vagrant. I informed them otherwise. They did not listen." The sharp click of a pen being dropped. A chair scraping against the floor. "Jesus Christ." "No," Luther murmured, tilting his head slightly, though the motion was more for himself than for the conversation. "Just me." Whitmore exhaled, and Luther could hear it, the shift in breathing, the tightening of posture, the way the very temperature of the conversation changed. He was no longer speaking to an old friend. He was speaking to a man who understood power and knew precisely how to wield it. "They booked you." Whitmore's voice was clipped now, the words precise, controlled, the sound of a gavel poised over a courtroom. "Not yet," Luther murmured. "I suspect they will leave me here overnight. A lesson, perhaps, one they believe I require." Another silence, filled with the sound of Whitmore thinking, his mind moving like a machine, cutting through possibilities and contingencies, calculating destruction. And then, soft but unmistakably lethal, he spoke. "That's not going to happen." Luther allowed himself a small, knowing smile, because that was exactly what he had counted on. Whitmore had never been a man who hesitated, never been a man who wasted time with outrage when action was required. He had built his career on precision, on tactical decisions, on knowing when to strike and how hard. He had learned that from Luther himself. And right now he was angry. "Tell me their names again," Whitmore said, his voice low, dangerous in its control. "Rower and Kincaid. And the sergeant on duty, Tom O'Malley." A quiet exhale, followed by fingers drumming against a desk, the telltale sound of a man reaching for a pen, for his phone, for the keys to a kingdom these men did not know they had walked into. "You know," Whitmore mused after a moment, his tone now disturbingly even, "this precinct has been under quiet scrutiny for years. Civil rights violations, excessive force complaints, a few missing body cam records. Nothing ever big enough to stick, but—" He let out a slow, thoughtful breath. "This, Luther, this sticks." Luther remained silent. There was no need to respond. Whitmore was already moving. "I'm making some calls," Whitmore continued, his voice shifting into something sharper, something razor-edged. "The Department of Justice will be notified. The Attorney General's office will be notified. Hell, I might just loop in the White House while I'm at it. Let them decide how they want to handle the fact that one of the architects of modern civil rights law has been unlawfully detained by two glorified security guards with badges. A beat. Then, stay exactly where you are." Luther exhaled slowly, his smile widening just slightly. "I had no intention of leaving." And then the line had gone dead. Now, in the holding cell, he could feel it beginning. The officers in the precinct were still laughing, still moving through their routines with the easy arrogance of men who believed power belonged to those who shouted the loudest. But Luther knew better. Power did not belong to those who shouted. It belonged to those who waited. And so he sat. And he waited. And he smiled, because soon, the first phone would ring. And by the time they understood what had happened, by the time they realized just how deep this mistake went, it would be far too late for all of them. Hours later, Kincaid wandered by the holding cell. "You're real quiet, old man. I thought you people loved to talk. Always got something to say about oppression and injustice." "You're a fool," Luther said simply. "Yeah? That's so. Yes. Because only a fool mistakes silence for submission." Before Kincaid could respond, Chief of Police Richard Sloan appeared. "Knock it off. We're just having a little fun, boss. We've got enough crap to deal with, don't add to it." Then the front doors opened. Claire Grant strode through the precinct, radiating fury. Beside her was Assistant U.S. Attorney Daniel Harrington. The officers stiffened immediately. "I want to see my grandfather," Claire said sharply. Harrington stepped forward. "Where is Justice Grant?" The young officer's face went pale. "Justice Grant. Sergeant O'Malley pushed forward. What's going on here? You're the commanding officer on duty? Harrington's voice was cold. That's right, Sergeant O'Malley. And you are? Assistant U.S. Attorney Daniel Harrington. I am here on behalf of the Department of Justice to investigate the unlawful detainment of a retired Supreme Court justice. O'Malley went white. Jesus. Where is Justice Grant? Harrington demanded. O'Malley turned sharply toward the holding cells. Harrington and Claire followed. When they reached Luther's cell, he was still seated, still composed, still waiting. O'Malley unlocked the door. Luther stood slowly. Grandfather, Claire breathed. Claire. Luther's gaze softened. Sergeant, Harrington said sharply, I want the arresting officers brought here now. When Rower and Kincaid arrived, Harrington unleashed his fury. What the hell were you thinking? You saw an old black man standing outside a restaurant, and instead of doing your damn job, of checking his ID, of verifying his name, you threw him in the back of a squad car like he was nothing. They didn't even run my ID, Luther said quietly. Harrington's head snapped toward them. You didn't even run his ID? You arrested a retired Supreme Court justice without so much as a second glance. Captain Sloan stepped forward, visibly shaking. You're both suspended. Effective immediately. Get your things and get the hell out of my precinct. Rower's face drained of color. For what? For doing our damn jobs. For unlawfully detaining a former Supreme Court justice, Harrington said coldly. For making an arrest without probable cause. For disgracing your badge. Your names are being forwarded to internal affairs. Every complaint against you will come to light. Your careers are over. Kincaid's breath stuttered. This is just politics. Luther shook his head. You still don't understand. You thought the badge gave you the power to decide who mattered. You thought your authority was absolute. You thought wrong. Your pensions in question, your certifications revoked, your futures ruined, Harrington continued. And there isn't a damn thing either of you can do about it. Sloan cleared his throat. What happens next? An investigation, Harrington said. This department will be investigated from top to bottom. Luther stepped forward. This isn't just about them. The corruption in this department does not begin and end with 2 officers. Captain, Harrington said, I suggest you prepare for what's coming next. Luther turned to Claire. Let's go. Together, they walked out into the crisp night air. Weeks later, the courtroom was packed. Luther sat at the witness stand, composed and commanding. Justice Grant, Harrington began. Please state your name and credentials. Luther James Grant, retired Supreme Court Justice of the United States. On the night in question, where were you? Standing outside the Hamilton restaurant, waiting for my granddaughter. What happened next? I was approached by officers Rower and Kincaid, who demanded to know why I was loitering. I explained I was waiting for someone. They did not believe me. I informed them I was a retired Supreme Court justice. They dismissed it. I presented no threat, raised no voice, but they made up their minds before I ever spoke. Then they arrested me. Did they ask for your identification? They did not. Did they read you your rights? They did not. Did you resist arrest? No. The defense attorney tried to salvage the situation, but Luther's testimony was devastating. I was detained because of an assumption rooted in bias. When they saw me, they did not see a citizen. They did not see a professional. They saw what they wanted to see. They saw me as a problem. The verdict came swiftly, guilty. Judge William Thatcher's voice was firm. This court sentences you both to 10 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole. In addition, you will each pay a fine of $150,000. Kincaid's face drained of color. Rower's fists clenched, but neither spoke. As the gavel slammed down, the officers who had once worn their uniforms like armor were led away in handcuffs. Justice had spoken. 3 weeks later, Luther stood inside the gutted 17th precinct. Federal oversight had stepped in. Nearly a third of the officers had either resigned, been placed under investigation, or dismissed. Captain Sloan had resigned, his pension cut by 50%, barred from ever holding another position in law enforcement. On the courthouse steps, Harrington addressed the press. This is not an isolated case. What happened at the 17th precinct is systemic. Federal oversight will extend into additional precincts. Grand jury investigations are already underway. What happened in this courtroom was not an ending. It was the start of something much bigger. Luther watched from the sidelines, his posture straight, his expression unreadable. Justice had moved. And tomorrow, it would move again. As Luther walked down the courthouse steps, the sun casting long shadows behind him, he did not stop, because there was still work to be done, and he was not finished yet.